like excited to be here. I hope it's palpable. I haven't been back to Madison since I graduated. This is my first time back, and it's been really fun just to walk around campus and remember the creaky staircases and the old haunts and all that kind of good stuff. I want to talk to you about a bunch of stuff today. I'm going to cram a whole lot into a little bit of time, and that's okay. I know normally we like to wait until the end and then ask questions, but actually I really enjoy having more of a conversation. Once I get going, I'll just keep going because I get excited, right? So I love to be interrupted with questions or, hey, can you rephrase that or whatever, and I'll take my time. What I really want to focus on is research we're doing right now on training scientists to become more fluid public communicators. But we're going to talk about some other things on the way there. What I like to do in this kind of talk, of course, is just give you a sense of who I am and why I'm here, and also how I got into this gig and why I started doing this research. And so for me, the origin story involves this super cool dude with his amazing turtlenecks. And I mean, do I need to ask, are you all familiar with who that is? I should have, okay, so that's Carl Sagan, right? So I'm a child of the 80s. One of my earliest memories is watching the original Cosmos series. And then watching Dudo growing up, those programs with my dad, and it just really, for whatever reason, it just captured my imagination, and I became really interested in basically all things science, right? I then started to move through my education and realized I kind of sucked at it, right? When I got into AP classes and stuff in high school, and I said, oh gosh, what am I going to do? I really love science, but I'm not very, I don't have the, whatever you want to call it, the right mentality, the right skill set, whatever, to pursue it in a more traditional sense, but at the same time, I was also getting really interested in media and communication. And as luck would have it, I was able to kind of start to marry those things when I was an undergrad. When I finished my undergrad, I got the gig of a lifetime, luckily. Actually, no, that's not true. My first job out of undergrad was working at a business newspaper, making $17,000 a year, which I was so stupid at the time. I was like, this is the best job ever! And then I realized after about a week on the job, no, it's not, it's slave labor. And so I got this other gig working at the Academy of Natural Sciences, which is actually the oldest continually operating natural history museum in the Western Hemisphere. Founded in 1812, houses lots of John James Audubon's original artwork and all sorts. It is the biological collections there are incredible. It was a really fun place to work. I was in the communication department, but it kind of reaffirmed a lot of the questions I had in my head about the combination of communication and science when I was in this job. How many of you have ever worked at or pretty familiar with the quote-unquote business model of a natural history museum? Anyone in the room who spent? Not really. They're really challenging. They're schizophrenic, and what I mean by that is they serve a lot of different audiences, and they employ lots of different types of people. So I think a lot of us, when we think of natural history museums, we think of, oh, that's where I went when I was little to see dinosaur bones, and that's great. But I'm going to tell you that's maybe 20% of what's going on at a natural history museum. Most of what's going on is behind closed doors. It's dealing with their biological collections and all the scientists who come from around the world to look at them, and also a lot of scientists who are going out in the world and building knowledge. And so for a communication professional, you have actually lots of different challenges because your mission isn't singular. You essentially have multiple missions and multiple audiences, which can make it really challenging. And this became, I'm going to tell you just a little anecdote real quick that I think is a fun one. I tell this story all the time because it was pivotal for me. My first week on the job, again, I'm 21 years old. The director of our ichthyology department, keep in mind at the time I didn't even know what ichthyology was. I had to learn that before it's a fish. And I was dispatched to go, this isn't the person, but I was dispatched to go interview this individual because he had just returned from the Amazon where he discovered a new subspecies of catfish. In his or her 50s, this was, for this individual, you can imagine, probably going to go down as one of the key moments in his professional or her professional career, right? Very excitable, really happy to have my ear and my tape recorder. This was, I'm dating myself, I had a cassette and a tape recorder right for the interview. Really exciting stuff. Had a wonderful conversation with this person for an hour. He or she did a really good job at communicating their excitement and helping me understand kind of the value and the so what about this particular discovery. And I had in my head, it was my job to then parlay that into a number of different communication tactics for public relations and whatnot at the university. And I had in my head, what I thought we could do with this. As I'm leaving the office, there's a parting comment from this individual. It says, so how soon should I expect to see news of my discovery on the front page of the Philadelphia Inquirer, which is the paper of record in Philadelphia. I think it still is. Now, so some of you chuckled. So you're low-hanging fruit, Adam, so I'm going to pick on you. Why did you chuckle at that question?
So I do communications, and if I pitch that to the journalist, I don't think it would be the front page.
Okay, that's it. So that's it.
Wrong outlet.
Right, so you know that. And so people who study communication or communication practitioners know that his expectations for that discovery being on the front page of the Philadelphia Inquirer actually were not reasonable. Nothing I could do was going to get it there, right? And so I didn't handle the situation well, and it turned that beautiful conversation devolved, and we repaired relationships later. But it was really symbolic to me because it provided this opportunity of how everyone had great intentions, but my perspective on communication was so fundamentally different than the scientist's perspective on communication. And so the question is, well, where's that come from? Why is it like that? And then how can we do a better job of engaging for a common cause, right? So this was a really important experience for me. To kind of sum this up, my experience there really made me say, hey, I want to, these are all research questions I had in my head, and I started to look at them that way as research questions and say, wow, wouldn't it be fun to go to grad school and study this? I started looking around and found people like Deidre and Dominique and Sharon Dunwoody and others who were actually doing this research, and I got really excited. And so my goal at that point became, I want to go do that research, right? And that's, I came to UW, as Deidre had mentioned, did my PhD here, had an office over in Hiram Smith Hall, thanks to Deidre and Dominique appointing me as an RA for many years, probably more than I deserved. And had a grand old time here and left in 2011. And so, we walk around, we have to describe what does our research program look like, and this is the heuristic we all use now to describe, I studied the science of science communication, right? Deidre's been key in developing that team, and Dominique as well, as my core research area. And if I have to break that down into kind of three pillars, which again, we commonly do, it's research that's focused very much on external audiences, so on the public opinion of science. So I'm very curious in how they come to develop science literacy or understanding or perceptions or about different STEM issues. It's also fundamentally involves understanding the corpus of messaging within the media and what that looks like and how that contributes to those outcomes for that audiences. Brownie points for anyone who knows what movie that is. Anyone? Really underrated, but really
Black
good.
holes.
Yeah, who said it? Someone got it. Interstellar. Widely panned, but a beautiful piece of art, if I might say so. Really great soundtrack. If you are ever working on something and you want your work to feel epic, more than it really is, listen to that soundtrack while you're working. It helps. And then last, and this is the area where really, I got looped in as a grad student into a really cool data set, one of the first of its kind, with Madison. A really lovely multinational study of scientists' communication perspectives and behaviors. That ended up being the core of my dissertation data. And I've really been primarily playing in this space ever since with my research. Very much focused on the expert community, understanding what drives them to communicate, understanding fundamentally how they do it, why they do it, etc. Really exciting area. So I just want to get a better sense for who's in the room. Bear with me. How many of you are in STEM? Raise your hands higher, make it easy on me. Okay, cool. All right. How many of you are in social sciences?
That's STEM.
Cool. Yeah, you can vote more than once. you could, yeah, okay. How many of you are in communication specifically? Okay. How many of you are practitioners, like communication practitioners? All right. How many of you are do I have any undergrads in the room? No undergrads? All right. How many of you are grad students right now? Okay, there we go. Great. And I have a couple UW. Any other UW faculty members in the room? Todd? Yeah, okay, got you guys. And then how many of you really like hooks, HTMGs? I'm buying a lot of that to take home with me, just making sure. I would say, I like you guys, that's great. Scaffolding for what I want to get through today. I'm going to talk a little bit about what we know about scientists as communicators first. That's not the focus of what I want to talk about. We can dig into that when we ask questions and stuff, but it's more just I feel it's important to kind of set that up because it makes clear why we're doing research that's focused on the training community. And then I'll provide some ideas for future research. So I think a lot of you in the room probably know this. This is just some meaningful context. So the notion being, I feel every time I write a paper, my lit review looks and feels the same for a reason. It's making the case for this notion for science communication has always been around. It's nothing new, but it does certainly seem like within the last 10 to 20 years that the calls for more science communication have become increasingly visible, increasingly vocal, increasingly hard to deny. There's lots of evidence that's, a lot of it being anecdotal, but that kind of sets this up. There's commentary about the state of the common American citizen right now relative to STEM, and all sorts of interesting polling data that comes out that suggests that in many cases the way they view certain STEM issues is fundamentally or extremely different than the way the STEM community views them. Some recent Pew data speaks to that. Traditionally, scientists have been rather insular and haven't been very proactive at communicating. So that's part of the issue here. Obviously, the media landscape has changed dramatically. I can't really overstate the importance of what I'd call direct-to-consumer science, and the fact that right now, in less than 2 minutes, anyone who's generating knowledge can whip out their smartphone and comment about that knowledge publicly, right? And we take that for granted, but it is actually, functionally, it's a very big deal. It changes the ecosystem for science communication dramatically. And so we have a lot of different reasons, of course, and we, look at some of Trump's tweets about science to think of that. And then the question becomes, okay, well, what's actually happening? Is there a shift within STEM? Is there more communication that's actually happening? Are they hearing these calls? Are they answering these challenges? And I think there's lots of, evidence out there to suggest that there is movement and there's a lot going on, right? So we see it's not uncommon at all to open, or glamour science journals like Science and Nature and the Proceedings, et cetera, and look at the editorial pages and see scientific leaders talking about, hey, get out there, engage more. Some of what they're saying sometimes doesn't make much sense, or it's not always very sophisticated, but symbolically it's important. There's more support resources. There's, in terms of much more of a focus on broader impact, so a lot of the federally funded research that's out there for science, like from the NSF, NIH, et cetera, you can't ignore this anymore. Broader impacts need to be really thoughtful and very thorough. Pedagogical shifts, things like your PhD minor in science communication here at UT and what we're doing here at UW and what we're doing down at UT and some other R1 universities. So on and on. Lots of evidence, I think, for this shift. The other thing which comes up a lot, I'm sure Todd, Dietrich, and Dominique have to make this point all the time when they talk about these issues, particularly to audiences in the sciences, is actually there's a whole literature. People have been researching these questions for decades at this point. And so in a real fun visual way to make this clear, in that situation I like to do this. And if needed, I could do this for 20 minutes, okay? And we continue to see peer-reviewed articles that bear on this topic, okay? So there are people doing this work. And so part of our battle, I think, is, and we'll come back to this a little bit later, is to make that clear. I'm not saying that there's certainly variance in the quality of this research. Some of it's more applicable than some of the other work, but it is out there, right? And so when it comes to studying scientists in communication, I think a quick way to think about it, and this is my view of the literature and where we are, so full disclosure, we often think about understanding descriptives and quantity. So how often are scientists, engaging or willing to engage, and what characteristics or factors are associated with a scientist who's more or less interested in doing this, participating in this kind of behavior? We can then ask questions that reflect on the quality. So how sophisticated are their communication efforts? What kinds of skills do they demonstrate when they communicate? What kind of strategic thinking do they demonstrate or not when they communicate? And what does the training landscape look? How much practice are they getting? Who's helping them? Who's empowering them to do this more? And then ultimately, I think where the most interesting research questions lies, so what? Well, what are the effects of this? Both in terms on the actual scientists themselves, on the culture of science, and on all these stakeholders and audiences with whom they're engaging, right? What does it mean? And so my look at the literature right now is that when it comes to quantity, we actually have a lot of research on that. When it comes to quality, we have some. And when it comes to effects, we don't have a lot. And this is conservatively, so I'm viewing this empirically as in terms of social science, not just anecdotes, right? So there's a lot of work to be done here, which I think for those of you that are in grad school that are looking to do this stuff, that should be really heartening. When it comes to scientists engaging, I would argue that for the most part they do so more than is commonly assumed, or they're interested in it more than is commonly assumed. I'm just pulling statistics, descriptives from different studies here to give you a sense of what scientists self-report in terms of how often they engage. So this is from, each of these is from a different study done in the last 20 years. Yes, we have absolute problems with these surveys. We have non-response bias, we have social desirability, yada, yada, yada. It's likely that we see inflation in these numbers. But even if we interpreted them more conservatively, we'd still see a pattern here that I think supports this general notion that there is a thirst among a notable group of scientists for this. We also have a lot of research on understanding what factors are behind this. And Dominique, here's your joke. This is my joke for you. This is my joke for you.
It's your joke.
Okay. So right now, all of your brains melted out of your ears, and that's fine. And I just couldn't help myself. I had to do this. So don't ever do that. Don't ever show a huge regression model the way I just did, unless you have a very specific audience, right? I just remember us talking about this, and it was like, oh yeah, that's so important. I might really want to geek out on that, but it won't work well with you all. My point in showing, yeah, go ahead.
I apologize if I'm asking you to jump the gun, but I'm wondering how you are defining engagement.
Yeah, with a lot of this data, it's extremely broad, and it's designed that way on purpose. And so whenever we have these surveys, throughout the survey, we frequently articulate the conceptual definition of what counts.
Okay.
Yes, that's very important. And you're right, because it means different things to different people. And when you're surveying folks about this, it's important to kind of keep that straight.
Okay.
So don't do this, and instead, this is just a real quick professional development moment, and this is, again, something I got from Dominique, is it's much better to create a new slide to show your data analyses and make it clear what's going on. And the point, don't worry about the point here, this is just my quick professional development, like I said. But what pops out in all this research that's focused on factors that are associated with it is really interesting because, again, anecdotally, and I hear this personally from a lot of different scientists, is the assumption that the big drivers of engagement are demographics, or what we call exogenous variables. So it's someone's age, it's someone's gender, it's someone's ethnicity, it's someone's scientific discipline, and that those are the things that are really strong predictors. Oh, astronomers love engagement and chemists hate it, right? Okay. When we model this, and when I say we, I'm using the collective we for people that do this kind of research, we actually don't see a lot of systematic evidence for that. And instead, what we see are theoretical variables that explain a lot more of the variance in the movement and a scientist's willingness to engage. And these are some of the ones that consistently, not all the time, but that consistently pop out in research that looks at this. So a scientist's attitude, his or her attitude toward the behavior or toward the audiences with whom he or she is likely to engage, their level of self-efficacy and their perceived response efficacy, and we can break this down later if we need to. Some normative assumptions associated with it, and often some of their orientations toward media and publicity and how that may or may not influence their career. This is what tends to pop out in those big models that I just showed you. For those of you that are in grad school and that are social scientists and looking to do some of this research, I expect that you look at some of these variables and you'd say, oh, that looks really similar to a theory that I've studied a million times, and you'd be right. So a lot of what you're seeing here is the theory of planned behavior, what we now call the integrative behavioral model, right? So this is not rocket science. This is a really robust social psychological model. It's been around for decades, replicated in a million different contexts. It's very powerful. We pick it up, we drop it in our context, and surprise, it explains, it predicts, yada, 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 and it functions. This is noteworthy because I think a lot of our early research in this area, dare I say, was atheoretical. Okay, so this is important, right, to actually be, and that's using the theory is what allows us to identify these factors that actually perform and matter more than some of those demographic variables that we all like to talk about and assume matter. Okay, yeah, question.
So I'm in astronomy and physics, and one thing that I kind of hear anecdotally but don't see here is how academically rewarded efforts towards communication are, and I'm wondering whether that's wrapped up in something here, or that's just hasn't shown to broadly be true as a...
We do collect, we've started collecting data on that, like to what extent are you incentivized, does it play into your P&T, that kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. Hasn't popped in our data sets yet, in our models, to the extent that these others do. But it's absolutely something we and I think others collect data on. That's the low-hanging fruit, I think, when people are interested in interventions to get scientists to communicate more. It's not the low-hanging fruit, sorry, it's actually really high-hanging fruit, but it's a conversation that comes up quickly, is, well, what we need to do is we need to provide concrete incentives. external incentives to get scientists and engineers to do this more often, involving things like P&T, raises, etc. To me, that's a silly conversation because that's high-hanging fruit. You're looking for cultural shifts where there's other things that you can do that might be more effective, and we can circle back to that.
And one of the articles that you clicked through actually is a piece that Dominique and I did in students on correlating age indices and impact within the ivory tower to engagement activities. So they were just work on, and we were not the first ones to do that either.
No, we're not, but from communication we were
Yeah.
the first ones.
So there's a body on that.
Yep. And so, okay, that's great. We talked a little bit about the quantity aspect, but now I think we get to talk about what's arguably, I think of these research, like these things as like, peeling layers of an onion, and you have to start out by understanding the descriptive landscape, right? So you have to know what that looks like. Then you peel that layer off with the research, and then you get to start to look at more interesting research questions. And so now that's fundamentally what we're doing here as a metaphor, right? And we get to start thinking about quality, the assumption being that this is actually really important. It's great to have scientists more willing to do it and arguably doing it more often, but we need to ask questions about, well, what does that look like and to what effect? And so that brings us to research that I would place kind of in this area, focused more on these issues of quality. And this is certainly, this is primarily most of the research that I've been doing for the last 5 or 6 years. And a colleague of mine who I work very closely with at Michigan State named John Besley, some of you are probably familiar with his research, have been doing this research program for a while, and we're both in strategic communication programs at our universities, in advertising and PR programs. Somehow we landed in these programs. And so a lot of these basics that you teach undergrads in StratCom, we were really interested to see, okay, are freshman people coming into PR and advertising understand this stuff after the first month of classes as freshmen? Do 60-year-old PhD scientists with Nobel Prizes also understand this? It sounds silly, but it's an empirical question. And we had a hypothesis, and the answer was no, they probably don't, okay? And so let's go out there and try to find some data that speaks to this issue. And so one of the things we were really interested in is to what extent do scientists who communicate have a goal, a concrete goal for their communication? In other words, do they know what they are trying to accomplish when they take time out of their busy lives to engage? Okay, it seems pretty fundamental, right? And then if so, what goals or what objectives do they view as being more important? What's there? We've done a bunch of studies on this, and this is just a quick glimpse at one of the earlier studies that we did. This is data from 2014, maybe 2015, I don't know. And where we went out, we were asking about these different objectives for communication, and what we find, the takeaway from this, is that scientists, and we continue to see this, tend to prioritize as a communication objective. I mean, take a guess, it's on the slide, but informing and educating, right? And then correcting misinformation or defending science from mistruths. Okay? That's not shocking, but it's consistently popping as that which is most prioritized. People in StratCom, and I mean, Dominique has lived this in her professional career, right? That's a really restricted communication diet. Like, that menu is really narrow. There's a whole lot of other objectives we can meet with our communication. And depending on who you're trying to talk to, those objectives may be a lot more important. Even if your ultimate goal is to educate, you may have to do other things to get there first. All right, so we view this as being quite restrictive. And the metaphor that we've fallen on to describe this in terms of what we argue and what we advocate for, are you guys familiar with the slow food movement? Okay, so we would argue that a lot of the science communication in the default setting that we see is actually, it's fast food. You have a very limited menu, you have quick turnaround, very systematic, not very thoughtful. Here's your burger and fries, ma'am, off you go. Here's your burger and fries, sir, off you go, right? And so we want to think about it as a slow food movement. So those of you who are familiar with it, what's it look like there? Can you draw the comparison between the slow food movement and what we're arguing for? Anyone? What do you do fundamentally in the slow food? Do you think more critically about your ingredients? Yes, you do.
Where they come
from. Where they come from, right? How fresh they are. Which ingredients go well together. Do you think more clearly about how you prepare the food? Yes. Okay, I'm just going to help you out. Come on, people, we're in Madison. If anyone knows the slow food
thought it
movement,
was
it's
a
you
great
all.
metaphor.
Yeah, my God, I really like this. I'm testing it out on you guys. I guess we won't use it. Although my Austinites would get this, so yeah. And you're thinking also very clearly about who are you serving, their experience when they're being served their food, when they're eating their food, and building that back into how you prepare your food next time.
It's
Okay.
a metaphor. I'm gonna,
Use it?
yeah,
Yeah.
I like it.
Okay.
And it's,
Thank you.
Thank you.
I mean,
I love it. Yeah, fist bump. Thank you,
also,
sir.
and it's value.
What's that?
And it's value.
Yeah.
It's not as cheap as fast food.
Absolutely, higher value. But what's clear, right, is that the effort and the thoughtfulness that's involved in slow food is higher or lower than fast food.
Much higher.
Higher, thank you. Jeez, people. Okay, right, it's higher. It's higher, all right? Okay, great. Let's talk about trainers. There are a lot of them. There didn't used to be. We just compiled a database with someone else from Michigan State and the University of Utah where we tried to the extent possible, exhaustively identify all the different training programs in North America. Okay? It's a moving target, so it's never going to be completely exhaustive. But surprise, there are a lot, okay, of all different scales. And here's some of the ones that I think are a little bit bigger and more well-known. So we see tremendous growth in this area. Again, how many of you are active researchers or researchers in training? Just show me a quick, okay? And how many of you have had some sort of professional communication training at this stage? So we have some of you, maybe about 25% of those of you raised your hand. So I just want to make sure we agree on a couple things before I proceed, right? We all eat, but that doesn't mean we're all chefs. Okay? I was super excited. There was a show on Netflix called Nailed It, and I remember my wife and I saw that and we're like, this is going to be so much fun. And it kind of wasn't that good. It was a real disappointment. And I can't resist this, right, for obvious reasons. The same thing applies, right? We all communicate, but that doesn't mean we're all good at it, right? I don't want to pick on Hodor, but, it is the situation. And so the way we get around this, right, is we practice. We educate ourselves and we get trained by people who conceivably know more than we do. And it doesn't matter what we're talking about here. This is like fundamental education, right? Even someone like, who's this? Just real quick, teacher, right? Okay, yeah.
I'm not going to say his
You're not
name.
going to say it. I don't actually like him either.
Good.
But
Number
he's,
10.
He's yeah, okay, that's good. I like that. Yeah. Preternaturally skilled, right, and gifted for this particular craft. And what has he done his whole career? Get coached, practice, get better, get trained, get boned up. Okay, that's great. So training, conceptually and I think empirically should matter. The issue here with that rapid growth in trainers, and what I would argue is the increasingly important role they play, belting out and providing training to thousands of scientists each year, right, is we can't just sit back and assume that all that training is of the same quality. And we should understand that ecosystem. Some training may be more or less appropriate for a particular scientist in a particular context, depending on what he or she is trying to accomplish. And so there are a number of funders who were interested in this question, fortunately, around the same time that we were interested in this question. And so we were able to kind of get into doing this research and have been doing it for a while now. So we've done 2 rounds of semi-structured interviews with important players in the North American training landscape. The first was in 2014 as part of an NSF grant that we had at the time. And then in 2017, we did another round a little bit broader because the landscape changed and grew over time. These conversations were remarkably enjoyable, and what was really clear was that this community of trainers is incredibly passionate and comes to their work from lots of very interesting different experiences. These are very obviously intelligent people who have a lot of intrinsic motivation to provide this kind of work, which is great. We're still analyzing a lot of that data and have some grad students kind of plugging away on it right now. I just want to give you some of the key things that popped out in the most recent data set, and frankly that we saw in 2014 when we did the first round of interviews. One of the things we wanted to understand is, well, who are you training? Who's it for? And the answer is for any scientist with a pulse who comes to us. Okay? So we deal with a lot of self-selection. There's not a lot of targeting. And there are exceptions to these patterns, let's be really clear. But there's not a lot of proactive, trying to find specific groups of scientists, specific populations of scientists to interact with when it comes to this sort of training. And we asked lots of questions about diversity. So how diverse are the scientists who you're training? And to what extent do you train them to interact with audiences who aren't like them, or stakeholders who aren't like them? And surprise, right, we're not there yet. All right, we're not there. Of great interest to us was the content, the curriculum. What are you focusing on fundamentally in your actual modules? What is the core content that you're trying to get across? And what we find is that it's very journalistic. It's very focused on skills. It's very much, here's how do you develop a lead paragraph for your science? How do you give an elevator pitch? How do you remove your jargon? And how do you tell stories, which is something I'm going to come to next. Often with very nebulous thoughts about why you're developing those skills, why they matter. For some big esoteric pro-science outcome, like more people that understand science, more people that like science, right? And I'm being kind of flippant here, but very nebulous, right? And so what we see, frankly, is a reduction of what's going on that's akin to the deficit model, which, do I need to explain that? I feel like a lot of it, we can break that down later. And so there's very little guidance that's focused in on strategic communication and on helping scientists understand that they can have different goals and what some of those goals may look like. And when we think about very baseline things from StratCom, like STP marketing, we just don't see a lot of that in there. So another thing that pops out is a really strong emphasis on story, tell story, please tell a bloody story. And I'm going to pick on Randy Olson, and I don't care. Storytelling is great. This is my perspective here. It is and can be a really great tactic for science communication, depending on what you're trying to accomplish and what your context looks like. It is not a panacea, and Olson would have us believe it is because he wants to sell his books. Okay? It is the answer to everything. No, it's not. It's a tool in a toolbox. Right? Now, I'm obviously betraying my own thoughts here. Okay. So really strong narrative. And again, that's not a problem in and of itself. The problem is it connected to something more than a skill? Is it connected to the strategy? Of course we ask, and this is really important, and again, in advertising we call this ROI, right? A client wants to know, I'm giving you all this money, what are you doing for me? Did you meet our benchmarks? Did you meet our goals? So the question is very simply, do you evaluate your training? How do you know if it's working? And there's no data on that. There's no data on that. No, we don't do it. We know it's important, or we do a real quick survey at the end of training that we design ourselves, that in many cases is horribly unsophisticated or horribly unscientific. Sorry, there are exceptions, right? Again, I'm talking across this whole landscape that we talk to, right? So it's an acknowledgement that we know that it's really important, but we don't do it. And often, to cut this community some slack, they have really legitimate logistical reasons for why they don't do this. They don't have the money, they don't have the talent, they're really busy just providing the trainings and don't have the time to actually sit back and evaluate them, okay? So anyway, this is, I think, just to connect back to other conversations that are going on in our area, a really like blatantly obvious place for researcher-practitioner relationships. And I am pleased to say, and certainly Todd and Dietram and Dominique have all been involved in these conversations now, where some of the really heavy-hitting training organizations recognize this and are really serious about developing these researcher-practitioner relationships. Right? What's the huge risk, by the way, for the practitioner when they invite researchers to come in and help them do evaluation? What's a really big risk for them?
Sure, it's not working.
Yeah, the data might give them a story that they don't want to see, that fundamentally cuts across their business model. But if they know what they're doing, they know they need to know that so that they can do what? They can get better, right? You can't just pretend you need that data. It's functional, it's imperative. And people, frankly, who are footing the bills for the trainers and helping to support them, at some point, they want to know what they're investing in, right? And I've had other conversations with different stakeholders in this space, and they say they have a really time working with trainers because they don't know what quality they're going to get, right? So they're a little bit circumspect. Another thing is the training has evolved from being very top-down, traditional lecture mode training, come in, sit in a room, I teach you everything about communication, you leave, to being a lot more interactive. We keep hearing the word fun. We like to have fun, okay? That's important though, right? For those of you that teach, this notion of interactive and interactivity is an important one. The flipped classroom, yada, yada, yada. So we see a lot of that, but then the next question is, to what extent does your training concretely enable behavior? Right? So it's one thing for you to practice something in here. It's another for me to train you and then say, okay, and next weekend I actually have an appointment for you, or like an opportunity for you to engage with K through 12 at the school down the street, or whatever it might be, right? There are some organizations, training organizations, that provide this kind of concrete connection. But learning science would suggest that when you learn something, it's important to do what? Quickly afterward. Use it. Use it, right? So this is, I think, a really important thing to think about too. And we don't see, for the most part, a lot of connection of teaching to actually enabling behavior, okay? We were really interested too in the interaction among these different players. How much do you all actually talk to each other in meaningful ways? The answer was not at all, but we're really interested, okay? We don't do that at all, with a few exceptions, but we're really interested. We would really value that. There's a lot of desire for interaction. Overall, there's a spirit of generosity. And when we asked them hard questions about feelings of competition toward one another, they did a good job of pretending like there's no competition. Right. With a couple exceptions, right? We also asked who are the thought leaders in this space. Each of the trainers we talked to, some of them had a really hard time actually just identifying anyone who provides training other than themselves. But when push came, which was really interesting, but when push came to shove, these are the three that popped out. The American Geophysical Union has a program too that would pop out sometimes, but it's primarily Compass, the Alpha Center, and AAAS. Another really fun and self-serving one, which I think is really interesting, is quantitatively and qualitatively, we're always asking questions to these different audiences about the extent to which they value social science or use social science. I'm really happy to say that when they do mention, if they say they use social science, I then immediately say, well, give me an example. Right? And I'm really happy to say that they often cite Dietram. They say, oh, Freeman. Yeah, Dietram's Wayflow. Okay? And they also love to talk about Dan Kahan and cultural cognition. And some of them refer to Randy Olson as you know, a social scientist as well. Anyway, and I forgot your recording. Editing. I
already wrote that down. That's
Thank you. I really appreciate that. Okay, that's awesome. And you know what we see here is not surprising. We don't have access to the social science. We don't have time to understand it. It's not accessible to us at all. It's not applicable. Again, with some exceptions. So you know, it may seem like I'm picking on trainers, right? And I don't mean it to seem that way. I actually see this as very much glass half full endeavor. But we, as social scientists, have a lot of work to do on our end too. Acknowledging the fact that a lot of our research isn't accessible, it isn't practical, it isn't useful, and we do a bad job of actually helping them have access to it and understand how to use it. So we have work to do too, to the extent that we truly care about having our research influence practice, I would argue. Some real quick thoughts on the future, and then we'll move on. These are just, you know, if I had to boil it down to 5 key things, you know, we're thinking very much, a lot of this research on the training is it's very practical. We publish from it, of course, but we also are writing reports for these funders who are paying for it. And so we have to give concrete examples of like, well, what do you do, right? And so when we boil it down to 5 things, or what do you do, this is primarily what we come up with. Facilitate interaction, it's necessary. If you hope to have best practices emerge within this ecosystem, you're going to need to give them an opportunity to talk to one another and trade war stories, so to speak. We have to spend some time focusing on evaluation. We need to understand effects and impact, good or bad or in between. You can't get around that. The curricula, I would argue, it's again, what's there is great, but it's a slice of the pie. It's not the whole pie. And I think, again, I'm biased, but I would argue in many situations that journalistic model can be part of it, but that the strategic communication model actually should be there or even a bigger part of it. In terms of diversity, a lot of work to do, and also in terms of coordination across not just these trainers who are key stakeholders, but lots of other key stakeholders here. So whether they're informal science educators, whether they're universities who clearly have a stake in this general issue, boundary spanners, professional science societies, et cetera, all have an important role to play. And a lot of them, our research would show they operate distinctly. That's not surprising. But the question is, well, particularly how can foundations and people who are interested in this find a way to connect and fit those pieces of the puzzle together? Way too long, but it's just exciting, and I have lots of stuff to talk about. So have at it. Questions? Let's talk.